while we wait for everyone to join, I'm just going to start with a few housekeeping announcements. My name is Thalia Sparling, and I'm the technical manager for this session on food environments and markets, session B, and it's going to be chaired by my colleague Selina Ahmed. Thank you for taking part in the ANH Academy Week. We hope you joined in the previous session on COVID and food systems, and we look forward to a robust and interactive session today. So just a quick reminder that everything you need to access the conference materials, the program, even the social media toolkit can be found on the ANH Academy website at anh-academy.org/ANH2020. So before Selina Ahmed takes the conversation forward, I just have a few technical announcements to ensure that our experience is as smooth and interactive as possible. First, as you'll notice, I'm recording this session and it will be posted onto the ANH Academy website following the conference. Second, all participants have been muted, but please introduce yourselves using the chat function. If you can let us know your name, where you're joining us from, and the organization you work with, that will be great. And if you can access the chat box, it's down at the bottom of your Zoom screen. If you click on chat, it will pop up on the right-hand side. We encourage you to share your webcam video during the session if you don't have bandwidth issues. If you do experience a loss of connection or low signal, you can turn the video off. If you prefer not to share your video, you could put a profile picture if you're already logged into your own Zoom account. Later in the session, we are going to open up the conversation with a Q&A. If you have questions, we invite you to share them in the chat box throughout the session, and we'll do our best to raise them during the Q&A. If we have time, we may have participants raise their hand and so you can speak your question aloud. Lastly, if at any point you experience technical issues, please do check your audio settings and your internet connection, and you can always try to reconnect to the session using the same Zoom link. If you have a technical question, you can please send me a private message in the chat box. So before I turn over to Selina, I'm just going to take a very quick poll. If you've watched at least one video of the pre-recorded sessions, could you click yes? And you can find the yes button in the participants tab. If you open up participants, you'll see a green yes and a red no. And this is just to gauge, this is not homework, we're just trying to gauge how many of you have browsed through the videos on our ANH website. So if I click yes, you can see my green, oops, I've got a few joining. Great. So I see that you've all found these buttons. You can also use these reactions down at the bottom of the screen to give us a thumbs up or a clap, and that just helps us to make sure that everyone is here and able to participate. Okay, over to you, Selina.
Thank you, Talia. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to all of you. Thank you to ANH Academy and to all of our speakers and participants for joining the session on food environments and markets. I am your facilitator today, joining from Montana State University in the Rocky Mountains of the United States, and I look forward to our dialogue today. We have a great lineup of presentations, which you have all hopefully seen the full presentations via the ANH Academy resources. And you can always refer back to those materials. I'm very excited to be focused on food environments and markets today, with food environments really being the consumer interface of the food system and increasingly being recognized as a critical place within the food system for designing interventions for supporting diets, nutrition, and health outcomes. And specifically market food environments, which include both formal as well as informal market food environments, are really critical as more and more households around the world are accessing their food from market and overall built food environments. There's lots of different ways of evaluating food environments, and our speakers today provide really nice examples of the different dimensions or elements of food environments that different researchers and practitioners evaluate, as well as different methodology. And today we have joining us Akua Tando from the University of Ghana, Jocelyn Marie Boteau from Cornell University, Savannah Froese from Purdue University, and Stella Nordhagen from the Global Alliance for Improved Nutrition. We will start off with Akua Tando, who highlights how food environments are not static, but rather that they're dynamic and how they shift with different factors, such as development. I'm going to pass it on to Akua, and just a little bit about the way our session will work. Each of the presenters will provide sort of a recap of their topic. This may be key points or key findings that they want to highlight in a sort of 3-minute presentation, and then we'll open it up for 1 or 2 questions following each presentation. And then after all 4 of our presenters have shared their presentations and we've had 1 or 2 questions associated with each, we'll open it up for broader dialogue during the Q&A session. So I'm passing it over to you, Akua.
Hello everyone, good afternoon from Ghana. My name is Akua Tando, and today I present a project titled Unhealthy Food and Beverage Practices in Everyday Life in Ghanaian Cities. I present this project on behalf of the DFC Untitled project team, which was led by Professor Michelle Holdsworth. Just a brief background to the project. Now, these 2 projects looked at dietary transitions in Ghana, and the first project, which is the Tackle project, was funded by the Global Challenges Research Foundation, and the DFC project was funded by the Drivers of Food Choice Competitive Grants Program. Now, the aims of our study was to explore how unhealthy dietary practices fit in everyday life in African cities, and then use our evidence to inform policy and interventions which could promote healthier diets. Now, the study was based in 2 cities in Ghana, one in the capital city, Accra, and in Ho, which is in the Volta region of Ghana. We sampled 301 people, adolescents and adults aged 13 years and above, and we did a 24-hour qualitative recall with them. In doing the 24-hour recall, we were interested in the time of day the eating episode happened, how long the eating episode lasted, and then who the participants were with and where they were when they ate. After collecting that data, we analyzed the nutrient and energy content of the foods that we had and developed 5 measures of healthiness. Using those 5 measures of healthiness, we analyzed and realized that energy-dense, nutrient-rich foods were most commonly consumed. However, when you look at the figures that we have, there was a widespread consumption of unhealthy foods. Now, to the time of day of eating episodes, we realized that the meal patterns were structured around 3 main meals a day, and for how long people eat, most eating episodes were quick. Now, we found that quick eating episodes were linked with eating unhealthy foods, and longer eating episodes were linked with eating traditional energy-dense, nutrient-rich foods. Now, to where participants eat, we found out that most of the participants eat at home, but then it's split between eating with family or eating alone. Now, the recommendations from our findings is centered around having subsidies on healthier foods and on and taxes on healthy foods. So that's it for a brief introduction of what the project was about. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Akua. We will now open it up for 1 or 2 questions. And so you can use your chat box to ask questions, or I believe you can raise your hand.
Go ahead, Catherine.
I'm sorry.
Yes, you're good.
Thank you, Akua. That was really interesting. I wanted to know, with our traditional foods like accepted by the younger generation, are they happy to eat them, or do they feel it's not cool? They want to eat more Western food. Does that have an effect on the dietary practices?
In Ghana, just to give a brief background, for the traditional foods, they are usually grains, you have cereals, legumes, and then you have an accompaniment, which is usually a soup or stew with meat, fish, eggs. With what we found, they eat those foods as well. They eat the traditional foods. It's almost even. We didn't analyze whether the youth were more interested in eating unhealthier foods. The focus was more on looking at the tempo, periodicity, and synchronization around foods that were eaten.
Thank you. And I see a question from Jan Lowe asking, did you examine any indicators of nutritional knowledge?
Yes, we did, but that was in another component of the study. With the projects that we had, there were different components. We had photo voice, we had the GIS, we had community readiness, and with the photo voice exercise that we had with the participants, we examined their nutritional knowledge. So yes, we did, but not in this component of the study.
Thank you so much for your presentation, and Akua, we will regroup with some questions following the other presentations.
All right, thank you very much.
Thank you. Next, we are going to hear from Jocelyn Marie Brateau. And often when we're looking at food environments, we're looking at linkages between the market food environment as well as dietary choices. And Jocelyn presents a really nice study looking at connections within the food system, specifically from the farm to the market food environment, really emphasizing the need when we're taking research on food environments to really take a whole food systems approach. So I'll pass it on to you, Jocelyn.
Hi, so I'm Jocelyn Brateau. I'm a PhD candidate at Cornell University. And so my presentation looks at the perspectives on quantity and quality food loss estimates across tomato supply chain actors in South India. Okay. So we conducted a study in Southern India where we surveyed tomato supply chain actors from the farm to the retail stage. And we chose tomatoes because they're a highly perishable vegetable and India is among the top producers. So the study objective, we focused on estimating both the quantity and the quality food loss along the supply chain. And we define food loss and waste as food intended for human consumption that is diverted away from human consumption. So if food went towards things like animal feed or compost or trash, then we counted that as food loss. So this is an overview of the supply chain that we looked at. So we started in Chittor district in Andhra Pradesh, where we surveyed farmers at the farm level on the day that they were actually harvesting the tomatoes. And then we went with them on the next day to the Madinapalli tomato wholesale market, where they sell their tomatoes at auction. And so this market is one of the, it specializes in just tomatoes, and it's among the largest wholesale markets in South Asia for tomatoes. So at the market, we also surveyed tomato traders that purchased the tomatoes from our farmer at the auction. Then in Hyderabad, which is about 500 kilometers north of Chittor district, we did monthly surveys with vegetable wholesalers and vegetable retailers who sell tomatoes. So a summary of our findings, based on this study, farmers reported that the most quantity and quality loss among the supply chain actors, and this typically happens at the farm level. The supply chain actors report different important tomato quality attributes, so these could be things like size, shape, or firmness, but there wasn't really agreement across the actors as to which, one or few attributes is most important. And then there were several data collection challenges that existed for each type of supply chain actor. So a recurring challenge was the timing of activities for each actor and capturing that in the survey. But more broadly, we really need more micro-level data on food loss for perishable vegetables, but more perishable foods in general. So it'll be important to document and also share knowledge on the different supply chain complexities to know the similarities and differences across the contexts. And there really isn't an agreement as to what the quality part of quality loss is. So this requires an understanding of quality loss assessment in the real world setting. And this would need field-based techniques to measure quality and then estimate quality loss. So that's all I have. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Jocelyn, and we will now open it up for questions. I'll start with a question, Jocelyn, in sort of focusing on quality of food loss. How did you sort of target the way you measured quality?
Mm-hmm. So we asked about quality in different ways in the survey. So we asked generally, how much quality loss do you think you have as an amount of what the farmers harvested or what somebody has purchased. We also asked about the quality grade. So in this context, they use like first, second, or third, or damaged as a quality grade, or A, B, C. But then we also use line scaling. So as a next step to look at sort of how people respond differently to the different questions to understand how they're conceptualizing quality loss, because is there really a difference between third quality and fourth quality? It might depend on the season as well, as to how much they differentiate. So we asked in different ways, but then we also conducted focus group discussions with farmers and tomato traders to really understand what exactly they're looking for in tomatoes. And we did a pile sort exercise actually using tomatoes to have them look at tomatoes and decide, how they would want to group them.
Wow, that's really fascinating. And overall, I find it really fascinating how perceptions of quality can really vary geographically or culturally. So really interesting study. I see a question that has come in. Did you find variation in extent of loss at the field level based on which variety was used?
So most of the farmers are growing the same variety. So I haven't looked exactly, I haven't crunched the numbers yet, but for the most part, around like 60% of our farmers are growing the same variety. And they're growing the same variety. So I'm not sure how much we'll be able to differentiate between the varieties, because then the next variety pretty much everybody else is using. So I can't answer that just yet. Yeah.
We will keep posted as your study progresses. Another question is, were there specific recommendations you were able to give the farmers based on your research?
So not yet. So I'm kind of midway through going through the results of this project. So the next step is to look at the determinants of loss. And then we'll have a better idea as to what exactly would be the potential intervention point, where then we could either provide recommendations or plan a study whenever that can happen to actually test out an intervention.
Excellent, thank you. And we will regroup after the other two presentations. So our next presentation by Savannah Froese highlights interactions between different dimensions of the food environment, including market food diversity and linkages to dietary diversity, as well as other outcomes. I will pass it on to you, Savannah.
Thank you. My name is Savannah Froese, and I am a PhD student at Purdue. I'm presenting on behalf of the entire effects team. Markets are a crucial source of food, not only in urban settings, but also for many rural households. However, there are many gaps in our understanding, both of what is available in markets and what households are purchasing. So our goal is to characterize market food diversity and household purchase patterns among our study population in rural Tanzania. This RCT includes fathers and mothers of almost 1,000 children aged 0 to 18 months across 80 villages. We collected data at the individual level, including 24-hour and 7-day food recall, and at the household level to look at food purchasing patterns. At the market level, we collected data about seasonal availability of almost 70 food items. And from our demographics, we saw that the median child age is 11 months, and median minutes to market is 30 minutes. And most households owned their own land and grew crops that contributed to household diet. This map of Tanzania highlights the Mara region, and here is a map of our study area along the coast of Lake Victoria.
Hi, Savannah. Sorry to interrupt you. We can't actually see your slides. I think you're not sharing them. If you, as a host, you should be able to right-click share.
Can you see now?
No. Oh, yes. There you go.
Oh, I'm so sorry about that.
All good. Thank you.
Okay. So here's the map of Tanzania that highlights the Mara region. And here is a map of our study area along the coast of Lake Victoria. Food items were grouped into the 10 food groups that contribute to minimum dietary diversity for women, and we surveyed 79 markets. Over 60% of these markets sold all 10 food groups across 12 months, and these are indicated as high diversity in orange. And we saw an overall high diversity of foods available in the market with minimal seasonal variation. However, we observed overall poor dietary diversity with striking differences within the households. Here are the results from diets as reported in the last 7 days. And you can see a stepping stone pattern for most of the food groups. Fathers had the highest consumption, and then mothers, and then children aged 6 to 23 months had the lowest. There's an additional food group that's included. So we disaggregated fish from other flesh foods because of the population. If you remember, they're right along the coast of Lake Victoria. And we see that fish consumption is very high in this population, but overall dietary diversity is low. And the question is, why is this when we have such a high diversity in the markets? Household purchases over the last month are indicated by the black bars on the left of each food group. And we can see that households rely heavily on markets for staples, pulses, nuts and seeds, fish, and dark green leafy vegetables. So here are the results of a mixed effects regression that we did, and we found that households within 30 minutes of a diverse market purchased more food groups. And we also found that household purchasing power, as indicated by total household expenditures, was positively associated with purchase diversity. So in summary, we found that markets are highly diverse throughout the year, But in contrast, we found that diets are poor, with clear differences between men, women, and children. And while diverse foods are available in the market, household purchases are limited by both physical and economic access. And interventions that improve market access can also improve diets.
Thank you so much, Savannah, and sorry about the confusion about your slides. It wasn't clear to me that you were presenting slides until you mentioned the map. Very fascinating presentation, and I will open it up for questions. And while we wait for questions, I can start with one question. Were there any methodological challenges that you faced in your research in terms of implementing market food diversity or any other sort of challenges based on methods?
That's a good question. We had a different level of specificity of the food groups that were consumed at each of the levels. So I mentioned that we questioned at the individual level, and we were very specific with 96 different food items. And then at the household level, we grouped those just to make it a little bit easier into 20 categories. And then at market level, we had about 70 food items. So there was, but I think we were able to make a good comparison between all three of those, and it was definitely a strength that we were able to gather that information at each of those levels and really get that detail.
Excellent. We have a question from Catherine Reeb. Did the area surveyed had high levels of malnutrition among children?
We did. We saw about 27% stunting for children in our population, so pretty similar to the country level levels of stunting.
Thank you. And a question from Julia De Bruin. Thanks for the presentation. Beyond seasonal availability of foods in markets, did you also look at seasonal variation in food prices as a determinant of accessibility?
That's an awesome question, and that is something that we are looking at. So in our market data, we looked at seasonal availability, we looked at prices, and we also looked at demand for each food item for every month of the year. So that is something that our team is looking at currently. I don't have any data right now, but that'll be forthcoming.
Excellent, thank you so much. And we'll have some questions at the end. Our next speaker is Stella Nordhagen. And often when we're looking at food environments, we're sort of looking at a comparison between agricultural, rural communities and cash income urban communities. And Stella's research really highlights the importance of taking really context specificity into consideration, and that not all communities sort of fit into this dichotomy. I will pass it on to you, Stella.
Great, can you see my screen okay?
Yes.
Excellent. So first of all, it's really great to see so many familiar names here in the chat. I just hope that next year I'll be able to see some of you in person. Hopefully the situation will improve, but it's really impressive what the ANH group has managed to do to make this conference work in a virtual form. So I'm really happy to be able to present. And I'm presenting on a study that was undertaken by a large study team led by Helen Keller International with the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health and Julius Nyerere University of Can-Can, Guinea, and funded by the Drivers of Food Choice program. And we looked at food choices and food environments in artisanal gold mining areas in northern Guinea. So artisanal mining is an informal livelihood. It's very difficult, it's very labor intensive, and it tends to take place in remote and rural areas. But it supports about 100 million people worldwide, including 12% of the population of Guinea. But the areas that are richest in mineral wealth in Guinea tend to be among the poorest in nutrition outcomes. So it was this paradox that was really motivating our study. I won't go into details on methods given the time that we have, but we, in brief, had 18 sites across 2 prefectures. Our research spanned nearly 2 years and used a mix of different qualitative and quantitative methods. And the results I'm presenting today are on the overall food environment, examined according to the framework of Turner et al. So in terms of availability and access, we found that there was really limited access to food from own production, which made many of the miners and other people who lived in their communities highly dependent on the market, which had many different types of vendors. We found that in these settings, ready-to-eat foods were common, as well as packaged, commercially produced foods. Most of these were cheap or sold in a range of sizes at different prices. And most of the snack options available were high on refined sugars, low on micronutrients or protein. And there were no appropriate complementary foods available, despite the fact that there were a very large number of young children present at the mining sites with their parents. Prices were often high for the most nutritious options, particularly compared to processed foods and staples. But we found in general that affordability was much more of an important factor than price, in that miners tended to be dependent on highly variable earnings based on how much gold they would find in a given day. So it was this kind of extreme day-to-day income variability that led to considerable variation in food choices and diets. Food vendors tried to accommodate this by offering credit to deal with these variable incomes. And they also worked to emphasize their hygiene and their food safety, such as by having a clean table or making sure that they looked physically clean. This was because perceived food safety was a key concern driving desirability and vendor choice among consumers due to the unclean environment available at the mining sites. People closely associated the idea of clean food with that of healthy food, and this was a major motivator of their food choices. So in conclusion, we found that the food environments in artisanal mining areas of Guinea are dynamic and diverse, but they're generally not conducive to healthy diets for either adults or the children who are often present at these sites in large numbers. We thus just concluded that there was an urgent need to develop programmatic and regulatory strategies to improve the food environment and help to deliver essential nutrition interventions, particularly for the young children. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Stella. It's wonderful to see everybody's recommendations following their research, and thank you all for keeping so much on time. Our first question is from Catherine Reeb. Do people live in the mining areas year-round?
In general, yes, they do. There are some mining areas that exist only as mining areas with no kind of village located there. And in those sites, sometimes they will be more seasonal because during the kind of heavy rains period, it's not actually possible to mine because all of the mine shafts get filled with water. But most of them are lived in year round.
Excellent. And the question that I have for you is your research focuses on several different dimensions of the food environment, and while you were carrying out your study, were there specific dimensions that you felt that you hadn't captured in your research that you would recommend for future research?
That's a very good question. I think that one that was a bit harder to capture was around desirability. Just in terms of particularly how do you measure that, right? And how do you kind of untease that? There were a lot of food choices that kind of proved to be implicit. So when you talk to people about why they were choosing particular things or what was desirable, it was difficult for them to kind of articulate that because they were so, used to that particular setting and those particular food choices. Another one that we did look at, but that just wasn't super relevant in this setting, was the idea of marketing and regulation. Basically, regulations don't really apply in these areas, and marketing was almost non-existent.
Thank you. I see a whole bunch of questions that have come in. Does this mining community receive, or do these mining communities receive any public sector service provision, such as community health and nutrition officers?
So not specifically for these communities, no. They are a bit outside the system, which was one reason we were very interested in studying them. They're kind of, illegal is a strong word for it, but they're not exactly fully sanctioned and promoted, and particularly the camps can change on a month-to-month basis, so there aren't a lot of fixed services available. Sometimes they do happen to be nearby towns that have a health post, but overall the health sector within Guinea has not a very strong one and has been devastated in recent years due to the Ebola pandemic and other things, so there's not a lot of service available.
Thank you. I'm going to ask you one more question, and then I encourage our participants to continue to put questions or comments in the chat box in Zoom. And these can be directed at specific speakers, or they can be questions that you would like to hear the perspectives from all of our panelists. And so I really encourage you to post some questions. And I'm also going to go back to some of the questions you asked previously that were not asked. So here we have one question. Jocelyn, the impact of such environment to the miners and food vendors needs to be further investigated because of negative impact of mining activities. So that is a comment. Is there easy access to cooking fuel or a need for heavy reliance on foods cooked or packaged in the market?
That's a great question, Jan. So for the meals that people would eat during the day when they're mining, and most people mine basically from sunrise until a bit before sunset, everything has to be cooked, purchased ready-made rather. There's not really an opportunity to cook there, both in terms of fuel and also in terms of other facilities. In the evenings when people are cooking for themselves, fuel is available, but it does have to be purchased. There's not really an ability to get firewood because of deforestation in the area. So that does feature into driving people's cooking choices towards things that consume less fuel.
Thank you. I am going to present a question that was asked earlier to Akua. And I'm just going to pull this up. Hi Akua, how did you deal with classifying difficult foods like red meat or dairy into unhealthy or healthy? Were there any challenges associated with this classification?
So what we did was in classifying such foods, say, for example, red meat, we used the method used in preparing the meat. So if it was fried, then it was classed as energy dense, nutrient poor. However, if it was boiled or steamed, then we classified it as being energy dense, nutrient rich.
Akua, you cut out right at the end. Can you just repeat the last few sentence? Sorry.
Oh, okay. So just to go over the answer I gave, with the classification of foods such as red meat, we used the mode of preparation for the meat. So if the meat was fried, it was classified as energy dense, nutrient poor. If the meat was either boiled or steamed, it was classed as energy dense, nutrient rich.
Excellent. I think that's a great question. And often, you know, as researchers, we have these methodologies, and then when we go to the field to implement them, sometimes our classification systems don't necessarily resonate with the local context. And I wanted to hear from all of the speakers if in carrying out your research, you faced any such challenges where you were sort of implementing some sort of measurement or classification system where there was a little bit of uncertainty regarding, you know, some choices you had to make in classification. So I'd like to hear from any of your speakers about that. If anybody else experienced something like that.
I guess I'll take a first stab. So I guess two things for us. The first thing was actually classifying or defining food loss. And so we based it off of the final destination of where the tomatoes would be going. So animal feed in particular, we classified as food loss, which some people may actually not consider that to be loss. But what we did find with our participants was that when we asked about final destination, often they lumped trash with animal feed because we let them tell us as many, you know, destinations for that particular group of tomatoes as they, wherever they would think it would go. So there really did seem to be a distinction between a destination where somebody would be eating it eventually versus you know, lumping trash with another destination that we did consider to be loss. The other thing we were careful about was how we defined quality, because again, all of our participants kind of looked at different quality attributes. So we kept it pretty broad in terms of our survey questions asking about quality, but then we had more in-depth focus group discussions to really understand what our participants are actually looking at or how they're describing the different quality attributes.
Thank you so much, Jocelyn. Savannah and Stella, did you have anything to add in terms of your research, in terms of classifying or any other similar points?
Yeah, one thing for me, and I think this is probably something that many people on this call have run into, our kind of original go-to indicators for diet were dietary diversity scores, but those don't really pick up on the question of consumption of ultra-processed unhealthy foods, which was something that we found, slightly to our surprise, because this is a rural, remote area, was very common. So we did end up capturing those kind of separately and presenting them separately, but it was a bit of the indicator wasn't fully fit for purpose in terms of diet quality within this setting.
Thank you so much. And I have a question for Jocelyn. Hi, Jocelyn. I enjoyed hearing about your study. You mentioned that foods perceived as clean are often considered healthy. Did this apply to various food groups or more so to certain types of food than to others?
So I think that might have been, there was a follow-up to say that was directed to Stella, I think.
Stella, okay.
Yep, sorry, I think that was meant to be to me. Yeah, so that was definitely an interesting finding, these kind of conflating healthy with hygienic and clean. And it did apply to certain food groups more than others. The one where it applied the most strongly was to meat products, because meat products were often prepared kind of as on like a spit, roasted right by the side of the road, or right by the mine shafts where there was kind of a lot of exposure to different chemicals. So we came up with early findings which were telling us that people thought meat was unhealthy. And we were a bit like, what's going on here? Why do you think meat is unhealthy? And as we looked into it, we realized that it was conflating this idea of healthy with clean and hygienic.
That's really interesting. And that kind of touches upon food quality aspects and sort of the different dimensions of food quality. I do have a question for you, Jocelyn, that was asked by Tanya Stathers. Were you able to explore how quantity and quality loss vary by harvest season, by rain-fed versus irrigated production, by transport container type, by handling method, by journey length, road type, by variety, etc.? And what did you find regarding any of these factors?
Yeah, those are all great questions. So I'll just kind of take it one by one. So we had planned to look at basically the seasonal effects, because tomatoes are harvested about year round, but there's a peak and a low season. Because of so the peak season in the area where we were is between, I guess, late April to late August, early September. And then the low season is kind of December through February. So we weren't able to capture the entire year-long cycle because of COVID. So we had to shift, we'll have to shift that a little bit as to what we're looking at. But in terms of rain-fed versus irrigated, pretty much all of our participant farmers are using irrigation. And also in terms of the container type, everyone is using plastic crates, most often a 30 kg plastic crate. And then in terms of handling method, journey length and road type, those are pretty hard to capture. So we do ask about the types of labor that they're using, which is all manual labor. And then we weren't able to collect data on the journey length or road type, mostly because the tomatoes are going like everywhere, all over India. And so we asked about where they would be shipped to, but we weren't able to actually follow them and understand those conditions. So we have more local factors to really understand the sort of the local context as to from the farm to the wholesale market, what's going on there.
Thank you, Jocelyn. Our next question is for Savannah. Thanks for your interesting presentation. Based on this, do you have any thoughts on feasible or ideal ways to overcome the identified barriers, especially physical, to market access?
Absolutely. There's, so I guess I want to start with that access to market is measured in many different ways. So sometimes it's measured by owning transportation, or it's measured by distance to market. In our study, we looked at time to market. And so I think that encompasses a couple of things, both proximity and also this concept of time use. So a woman's time use and her time burden. And so I think that studies and interventions who are looking at access and looking at improving market access should also be really sensitive to what else is going on in a woman's life, her specifically, because she's the one often in charge of purchasing and preparing foods. So I think sensitivity to time use, and in addition, just her capacity to have control over funds and to be able to make purchases. I think that should be something that interventions could look at as well.
Excellent, thank you so much. I have a question for all of our speakers that comes from Catherine Reeb, and I'm just gonna call on each of you to respond to it. To all, could you address how any recommendations from your research will be shared, including to government, public health, and or the community? So whether you've done this or your plans for the future, it'd be sort of great to hear your dissemination and outreach plans. We'll start with Akua, and if we are having trouble in terms of connectivity, I would encourage you to turn off your video. So we'll start with Akua.
Okay, so yes, we held a number of dissemination workshops where we invited government level stakeholders, and I am aware that some of our findings are being incorporated into the revision of Ghana's non-communicable disease policy. So yes, in our dissemination, we targeted government officials so as to inform policy. Yeah.
Thank you. Next is Jocelyn.
I think it's a great question, and for us, because my study was interrupted because of the current situation, so we are having to kind of change our dissemination plans a bit, but we'll likely rely on the Tata Cornell Institute's local office in Delhi to help us connect with different stakeholder groups that we can share these findings with.
Thank you, Jocelyn. Savannah.
Yeah, we're definitely planning our dissemination findings after our intervention is complete. That'll be here in the next few months. So we've invited local and national stakeholders, but of course all of our plans are a little bit in flux right now because of COVID.
Absolutely. Dissemination and outreach in general has definitely taken new forms. Stella.
Yeah, I agree. It's an excellent question. So we tried to integrate this process kind of throughout our research. So we had 3 different stakeholder workshops at various points in the process, beginning at kind of the conception of the project and going through 2 different phases of data collection. And that included government ministries for different ministries, as well as organizations and the local mining associations that are kind of the informal leaders of these areas. And we had a great plan for a dissemination workshop in March, which of course did not end up happening. We're going to see what we can do to organize that one in the future. It's quite difficult to switch to digital in these areas because many don't even have electricity actually. So yeah, trying to do a Zoom call is a challenge. And we're also preparing a policy brief for kind of the ministerial and UN audience.
Thank you. And then in hearing the other speakers, do you see opportunities for collaboration in the future? You can all think about that question while I field some more directed questions from our participants. So the next question is from Akua. Interested to see the high frequency of eating alone in this study. Any reflections on this finding and whether this was associated with certain demographic groups or characteristics? And that is for Akua. see if you are unmuted. I'm going to ask to unmute you.
Yes, sorry. The question was on if we assessed eating alone with demographic groups. I don't have those results at the moment, but I will check and then update with an answer.
Thank you so much. And now a question for Jocelyn. Are consumers taste sensitive or do they go more for unblemished products? So again, getting at desirability.
So that's a great question. So we stopped at the retailer, and we didn't actually interact with any of the consumers. But based on what our participants reported to us in terms of what the consumers desire, it seems like it's very regionally specific. So an example would be, these really small, very ripe red tomatoes that can't really travel long distances are very desirable in one area because they're used for sambar, which is like a very cooked tomato dish. Whereas the larger semi-ripened tomatoes that are larger are desirable for this longer transportation to reach these consumers in another part. So I think consumer desirability for tomatoes, and in terms of damage, I mean, there's also a really big range in terms of what consumers are willing to buy, and a lot of that has to do with what they can afford. So there are just very large differences in what's desirable versus what is also affordable that make it a bit complex to know exactly which consumers, what they're looking for.
Excellent, thank you. I'm going to have one more targeted question and then have a wrap-up question that's for everybody. So the final targeted question is for Stella. Was there any nutrition education occurring, and if so, via what pathways?
So in theory, nutrition education, particularly for pregnant women and mothers of young children, is available at health centers. In practice, basically nobody actually is going to the health centers to get that education, and it's not clear if it would actually be delivered consistently if you were to get it. Aside from that, there's no other nutrition education that is happening in these areas.
Thank you. And so sort of related to that response, and we can start with you, Stella. So thinking about the future of these populations, what sort of interventions would you recommend to improve diets and nutrition and health going forward? And that's a question for everybody. So we'll start with Stella, then Savannah, Jocelyn, and then end with Akua.
Yeah, sure thing. Kind of ironic because my answer is actually opposite to the prior topic, in that I don't think nutrition education is the main option that should be used here. I think there's some space for it, particularly on the area of food feeding frequency for young children. But aside from that, I think the constraints that most people living in these areas are up against can't really be solved with education alone. And there needs to be much more work to address issues of availability and access to affordable foods, and particularly the affordability question. I think two forms in which that could take in this particular context is trying to work more with vendors at these sites to ensure that they are selling nutrient-dense foods that are suitable for young children in particular. And second, working on types of interventions that might be able to help with smoothing income over time. As I mentioned, highly variable incomes were a big driver of poor food choice in these areas. So some kind of intervention that could allow for smoothing income over time, such as through village savings and loans, different types of microcredit and savings programs, would be the type of interventions that I would foresee being useful.
Thank you, Stella. Savannah?
I definitely agree with the points that Stella made. Those are good points. I think there is definitely a place also for at the family level. So not just looking at nutrition education, absolutely, but looking at empowerment and looking at time use. I think in conjunction with this improved market access and availability, as we're showing that even households that are producing their own food are sourcing a lot of their food from markets. So looking for interventions to improve that access. So.
you. Jocelyn? Jocelyn, you're on mute. Oh, there we go.
Yeah, I guess following along with what everyone's saying about availability, so particularly in the framework of my research, it's, you know, the smallholder farmers that we work with are are producers, but also consumers. And so not only having food available, but also making sure that when the producers who are producing these healthy food items, that they're also being, you know, getting it. It's affordable at the market, but they're also being able to earn an income from their work.
Thank you. And Akua?
Yes, so just as everyone has said, I would resonate the same. In addition to nutrition education, in Ghana, we could look at subsidies on healthy foods and unhealthy foods, taxing unhealthy foods to make them unattractive to people. And then also with the nutrition education, we could look at cooking methods, how to implement interventions that would educate people on implementing healthier cooking methods. So that's what I'll add to what everyone has said.
Thank you. And so I wanted to bring that question I asked a few moments ago. Do you see any opportunities for collaboration? We just have a few moments left, so I wanted to take the time right now to thank all of our participants for joining. All of the ANH resources are on the website, yeah, we have just a few more moments. So in the final moments, I would like each of our speakers to sort of think about the key take-home message that you want our participants to walk away with from your presentation. So one thing that you really want people to leave this session just keeping in mind, I just want you to think about that. And we'll start with Akua and then we'll move forward. So just a final thought, just one key take-home point that you think is really important for people to leave this session with.
The home environment and family are key to healthy diets. So we should encourage eating with family, eating at home. That's what I would say.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
Jocelyn?
Yeah, I guess to sum up, I would say, you know, fruits and vegetables are important, as we know, but we don't have enough of them available in the food system. And so we really need to think about the food loss along the way of these perishable products, but we also need a lot more data on understanding what the issues are.
Excellent, thank you. Savannah?
I would say that we're seeing that even in these rural populations, that they're highly dependent on markets for food, and I think that that needs to be a part of studies going forward, and that the problem may not necessarily be the availability of foods. We saw high availability in markets, but just these individual households' access to markets, and really brainstorming how can we improve that.
Wonderful. Stella?
Yeah, on a very similar track, I would say that when we're looking at food environments in rural areas, we have a tendency to assume that all households are agricultural and that the main determinant of diets is what people are growing. But I think a lot of the research presented here, including my own, demonstrates that there's a lot more complexity. Even in rural areas, markets are really important and there are different diverse sources of foods. So we really need to adapt our research to take better account of that diversity, including in rural areas.
Thank you so much. I also found the session enriching. I've learned so much from our speakers and the wonderful questions, so really appreciate all of this. It's given me a lot to think about in my own research. I think it's really highlighted the sort of dynamic nature of food environments and their connectivity to other systems, and the need to really take a food systems approach when we are looking at the food environment and connections to environmental and human well-being. So thank you all so much, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the sessions. And again, all of the resources are available on the ANH website. And I'll pass it on to you, Talia, for any concluding comments.
Yes, thank you to all of our presenters and all of you as participants. This was a really great interactive session. And as you know, all of these presentations were recorded. This session will also be logged and available on our website. And I just wanted to mention that after a short break, if you're not too exhausted, we have some time to connect in a more informal way let's see, it is at 4 o'clock. There is a session from the African Nutrition Society, which is a friends and family event. If you're interested in Amana fellowships, there's a question and answer session. And then you could join, or you could join me and Lauren with your pet or plant. Lauren will be at home with her adorable cats, and I'm gonna go to my city farm where I volunteer and have some time with the goats and piglets. So if you feel like a bit of open-ended thinking about our plants and animals in our lives, please do join us or one of the other sessions. And we also look forward to seeing you tomorrow. So thank you. I'm gonna stop recording now and I'll end the session. Thank you very much to everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.